Padfield of Bath Soft Cheese. We farm here at Kelston near Bath. We keep over 160 cows, and we've been here for 3 generations, over a century, making cheese and milking cows, and I'm going to be telling you about that, and I'm also going to be reading to you some of my poetry. So this, as many other farms are, is a family farm, and I'm in the process of handing this over to my son, which gives me time to write poetry. But with every handover, there's always friction. You've got the older generation who've got tons of experience, and you've got the younger generation who've got tons of energy, but no experience. So there's always a bit of tension, and it's given me time to write this. Parents, they are always right. Modestly, they point the way, tell us how to live our days, though we resist and fight. They forgive us in the end, though their mistakes do us offend. How easily they lived their lives, took everything within their stride. But we, the children born naive, have endless trials to supersede. Then as our parents leave this earth, their place is ours, and our roles reversed. Now, farming has always been an arduous occupation. It's probably less arduous now that we have electric motors and electric lights. But in my father's day, the cows were milked by hand, there was no electric lighting, and someone had to go to get the cows first thing in the morning, and that involved finding them first of all. Sometimes on dark mornings it was very difficult to find them, and my father was always quite pleased when a female calf was born, which was white, and he'd say, wouldn't have much trouble finding her on a dark morning, because he was used to going down the field and looking for them, having to walk all the way around the outside with no lighting. And then quite often they would milk the cows, and at the end of milking they'd say, "Where's old Buttercup? Have you seen Buttercup?" And somebody would have to go back down the field and see if they could find old Buttercup. And sometimes she'd be in a corner with a sort of come and get me look, and sort of not particularly bothered about going in for milking. But today it's a bit easier than that. But you imagine what it was like, not only, today we'd go and switch the lights on. In those days, they had to light candles or light lamps so that they had enough light to work by. And then the milk was put in buckets. First of all, it was stripped from the cows into the buckets, and then the buckets were carried to another building to be tipped into a cooler, and where it would trickle down over the corrugated, tin-plated cooler to be cooled down to roughly about 15 degrees. And then it was put in churns, and then my father would take some of those churns into Bath on a pony and trap before he went to school every morning. And it must have been particularly arduous on cold and frosty mornings or misty mornings. And so winter must have been a struggle. It still is a struggle today, because we have to make sure that we've got enough silage to feed the cows. We only get 6 months to grow the grass, to make into silage or hay, to give the cows in the winter. It's got to be adequate for the cows all winter. So if spring is late, it's an absolute disaster for us. But first of all, I want to read to you a few words about winter and how we cope with winter and look forward to the end of winter. Hearts be glad. When sun is low, too tired to properly rise, depressing is the winter's dread embrace. And blanket mist blots out the once blue skies, and ruddy faces are obscured by breath. Then winter's here, and with it drawn in nights. The days are short and can be deep in gloom. Then, unannounced, A morning comes that's bright, the vast majestic sky a stunning blue. Their naked branches against the sky are proud, and in them you may see a robin sing. That sight and song lifts spirits from the ground and makes us feel our souls have taken wing. Then winter seems not so especially bad, that we endure the worst, so that our hearts be glad. Now, we're organic here, which means that we don't use artificial fertilizers to feed the grass. We depend on productive grasses and clovers to provide the forage for the cows to grow and make milk. The management of the fields is terribly important, because if you left a field and didn't do anything with it, you'd end up with thistles and dogs and stinging nettles and dandelions and things that the cows don't actually want to eat. Those plants have evolved to be unpalatable. You know, that's how they grow, that's how they survive. Well, we want grass. We want to suppress the vegetation that we don't need, which is indigestible and unpalatable, and encourage grass to grow. So the first thing you do is you plough the field. You plough the field, you invert the grass so that it's buried and dies, and then you prepare a seed bed on the top. A seed bed means fine particles. And that, in fact, in our soil, we tend to have heavy soil here, so we need weathering to do that. We need periods of sunshine and showers, and in the winter some frost. Then we get a lovely seed bed, because we're planting seeds which are only about 1 millimetre in size. And then we have a nice grass lay, which is nutritious to the cows and produces lots of milk. If you look at the cows we have today, you will see that they are mainly black and white. And that means that originally they were, black and white cows, which are Friesians, British Friesians. So what we're looking for is high butterfat and high protein in the milk to make good yields of cheese. And so years ago, my father would have gone through, every generation goes through this, that my grandfather kept shorthorns here, which were a productive milk breed. And when my father started farming, he thought, shorthorn's a bit old-fashioned, I need something that's going to produce a bit more milk. And he chose the Ayrshire cow from Scotland, and he bought Ayrshire cows from Scotland. They came down from Ayrshire on the train down here to Kelston. And then when I came home from college in the 60s, we changed to black and white. But we've still got the Ayrshire influence in our cows. We've still got, they're a bit smaller and a bit darker. So today we actually have a mix of genetics in our herd. We've got some shorthorn influence, some Ayrshire influence, some British Friesian influence, and some American and Canadian Holstein influence.
So we've got 160 cows in the herd, and they produce just over 1 million litres of milk for us per year, which is quite miraculous. If you think those cows are only grazing grass, that they can go from eating grass in the field to producing 1 million litres of the most nutritious substance really known to man. Milk contains fat, sugar, protein, everything a person needs to grow, which is why we as babies drink milk. And that's what we put into the cheese, and it's the goodness of that milk and the high butterfat content of that milk which gives the cheese the creamy, sweet flavours that our cheeses tend to have.
So springtime is a time of great anticipation, because it's so essential to the profitability of the farm. A delayed spring is disastrous, and an early spring is wonderful. And so here's a poem about the spring, and it's called Life's Feast. The wind is easterly and cold. It feels like snow. Naked trees wait to be dressed. They shiver in the breeze, awaiting leaves to clothe them after rest. The spring, like a bride, is late. patiently the country waits. In hedges white with May, a robin sings to welcome in the spring, but winter stays. Seeds in sacks wait to be freed, wait their chance to grow and breed. Soft seedbeds wait the drill, to place the seed where it will breathe new life in age-old fields. Dusk is full of lilting song, as birds rejoice, dull winter's gone. Yarded cows stand by the gate, on the air they smell the sward, while a lusty blackbird calls, desirous of a mate. Turnout comes, out cows race, the fields accept their striding weight. Little birds build their nests, pretty lambs race at speed. On the blossom, insects feed. The spring is at its best. Cows' backs are warmed, touched by sun, in luscious grass that's warm and young. With sure steps their hooves impress the herbage as they graze. Larks high up in the vast blue haze trill as they progress. Magically, the trees are robed, displaying that they are betrothed. The season is so young and fresh, as bride and groom deep in love look joyful as they move. The country looks its best. Another winter's come and gone. Self-assured, life carries on. In the spring, the farm comes right. Plants grow, livestock breed. Spring is here. All must feed on the feast of life.
So after we moved out of the old stone cheese room back in 2014, there was a question mark over what we were going to use those cheese rooms for. And my father decided to turn his hand to cider making. And so he collected some of the cider apples from the ancient orchards that we have on the farm, and he started making cider. But he did that on a fairly hobby basis rather than a professional basis. He just wanted to see if he could make a really nice Brittany-style cider with a little bit of fizz.
As a boy, I was always interested in the idea of making cider. I make some cider, most of it is used for washing the cheese in, but the interesting thing about it is that I'm using the press that my father bought for me when I was in my teens, and the press was actually a cheese press, ironically. He bought a cheese press for pressing apples, which I now use, so that original press is being used not for its original use, but being used to press apples into cider.
But around the same time, we were looking to introduce a new cheese to our range, and so amongst us we experimented. That cheese is made using the curd from the Wife of Bath mates. Unlike the Wife of Bath, we press the curd. So we mount the curds into the cheese molds that are for pressing the cheeses. We press the cheeses overnight. That's to squeeze out the last bit of moisture, and one of the cheesemakers started washing the cheeses in the cider that my father was making, and that encourages a B. linen bacteria, a bright orange, very pungent bacteria, to grow on the rind of the cheese, and this developed a lovely orange rind on the cheese, which then penetrated the cheese with a lovely autumnal leafy flavour through the cheese, and we called that the Merry Wife, both because it's cheese that has been washed in cider, and therefore, like any of us, would be merry after being washed in cider. But also, there's a nice reference in Shakespeare, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, to a cheese-loving Reverend Hugh Parsons. And so there's a kind of a double link to the cheese, following from the naming of our Wife of Bath cheese after the character in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. We also have a link to Shakespeare in the Merry Wife cheese.
This is a display of the cheeses we make here, all made with our own milk, all organic, all made by hand. First of all, we have the Bath soft cheese, which, as it says, it's mould ripened soft cheese, beautifully wrapped here. And the next cheese that we made was the Wife of Bath cheese. We call it the Wife of Bath cheese because it's nice to hold, like a wife. It's a hard cheese, and it's made in a basket type process, which we'll talk about later. Then we have a blue cheese that we made. This is the most difficult cheese of all to make because you have to make it twice. In fact, you make a curd, and then you break it up. You break up the curd, you put it in a mould, and you incorporate the air gaps so that the blue mould can grow in the presence of air. And getting that texture right, the texture of the curd correct, is very, very difficult. So we're very pleased with that. And we won the World Cheese Awards with that in 2014. And then we have the Merry Wife of Bath, which is a wife of Bath which has been washed in cider frequently. And we like to call this, because it's a wife of Bath that's been washed in cider, we call it a Merry Wife because she's been sozzled in cider. So that's the cheeses. Now, we make them in much the same way that my mother would have made them or my grandmother would have made them. And my mother learnt her cheese making skills at Reading University. And when she was there, she used to tell us a story about how she learnt cheese making. And quite often she was on the opposite side of the vat to a rather good looking boy student. And as they stirred the curd and the whey, trying to get the right texture for the cheese making, their hands would touch. There was a sort of electricity going between them. And she always giggled when she told us this story about her young romance. So that's how cheese was made then and how we still make cheese today, the old-fashioned way of making cheese. Now you must be wondering what these cheeses taste like. It's always fascinating to me how we watch these cookery programs and nobody can actually taste the product. So here we are. This is the Wife of Bath. I don't know if you can imagine how this tastes, but I'm going to read you some words now that might help. Think of early morning sun coming up through trees. Then a breeze comes and gently sways the leaves. Sunlight falls on farmyard walls, makes dappled shades on backs of cows and timber boards. Now, see a dairymaid with bucket full and fresh. See her pause and gently place the milk to rest. This is how a wife of Bath will taste. Brimful of life and earthy love, but at the same time, blessed.
My father wanted to make a hard cheese. He also wanted to make the kind of cheese that farmers had traditionally made before cheese making became more codified. And he, in his reading about cheese making, he understood that cheese had typically been made when the milk started to go sour before it had been sold for drinking. And in that situation, they would take the milk and they would make a very simple curd. They would then put that curd in a cloth and either hang it from a beam or put it in a basket, and you get these lovely round shaped cheeses that were unpressed and had a sweet flavour. And so my father set about trying to make a cheese like that, and that's what the Wife of Bath is. After being left overnight in the colanders that replicate the shape of a basket, we then put them into brine for just over a day, and that absorbs the salt. So for all cheeses, it's very important that salt gets into the cheese. That preserves the milk and stops the milk from going off and allows the cheese to develop. So after being in the brine, we then take it out and we put it on shelves so it slightly air dries during the following 6 months as it ripens. We're turning those cheeses and rubbing them every week. By rubbing them over, we stop mold from growing on the cheese and allow them to continue to air dry. And it's that air drying process and that slow ripening of the cheese that allows it to develop slightly nutty, sweet flavours in the cheese. And then after 6 months, our normal wife of Bath is ready. We hold some cheeses back for between 12 and 18 months to be our extra mature cheeses. That's what our extra mature wife of Bath is. A slightly drier, firmer cheese with slightly nuttier, more caramel, more fudgy flavours. And that cheese has been particularly popular with people who like a slightly more mature cheese.
So one of the things that's changed farming beyond all recognition in some ways is the amount of mechanisation that we use today. In my grandfather's day, everything was done by manpower or horsepower. If you wanted to plough a field, you had to walk behind a horse for every furrow, the length of every furrow, every furlong was walked behind. You had to plant the seeds behind a horse. You had to, if you wanted to cut the crop, you cut it almost by hand. And then you thrashed it. Well, you might have had a thrashing machine. Victorian times, thrashing machines were invented. But most things were done by hand. You had to load the stooks onto a horse and cart. You had to carry them to the rick. You had to place them in the rick. And then later on, you place them into a thrashing machine. Today, we don't just have horsepower. We have tractors, which are worth several hundred horses in power. And so that's changed the face of farming. Although we still gather the crops and conserve the crops and feed them to animals, the rate of work and the amount of physical effort that goes into it is much reduced. But some things can't be replaced by machines, and that one of those simple things is simply moving cows across the road to grazing. The cows have to have fresh grazing each day. And in the summer, it's quite hard to find fresh, nice grass that's going to keep them milking well, because it's too dry. So we move our cows across the road, and of course that has to be done. That's a manpower thing. And here's something I wrote about that process. As a farmer, you must always put your livestock first. Give them food and shelter, and never let them thirst. So in the hot, dry summer weeks, when grass is getting parched, we move our cows across the road to graze the aftermath. I used to think this was a chore, and what could be better found than leaning on an old stone wall in case some car came down. But now I cannot help but say, and you may say I'm getting old, that now I want to savour days, not rush to see the world. So let the cows slowly walk and carefully place their feet, and I will ruminate on how this pace of life is sweet. And there's obviously lots of interesting, fascinating stories about farming and how it's changed over the years. But one of the things you'll know about farmers is that they're never satisfied with the weather. It's either too wet or too dry or too hot or too cold. So here's something I wrote about a farmer who was always too hot. The farmer was always hot and liked a window open. His wife, she always needed warmth, not lots of ventilation. So when at night they went to bed, he liked to bare his bottom, but her, she liked to cover up and slept with quite a lot on.
We realised that actually what we really were missing was a blue cheese to complete a cheese board. Me and my father are both big fans of Stilton, and so we started looking at if we could develop a blue cheese. And around 2007, 2008, we started making the Bath Blue. Again, we've tried to keep the way that we make the cheese very traditional, so there's a lot of hand making of the cheese. So we make the curds in buckets, we pour the curd into cloth-lined crates which is to replicate the pouring of curd into cloth-lined Stilton basins, stone Stilton basins. We then leave the curd to drain overnight, and the following morning we mill the curd. Once the curd is broken up into small walnut-sized lumps, we mix it with salt, and we then place those curds into the Stilton moulds. By placing the curds into a Stilton mould by hand, we give it a very even level of compression right through the Stilton cheese. And that's important because it's those small gaps between the lumps of curd that allow the blue mould to grow through the cheese, giving it that lovely marbling effect. And so we were doing better and better with that cheese, but then what really gave us a boost was in 2014, I got a phone call from the person running the World Cheese Awards. And he said, Hugh, I've been trying to get hold of you and your father. Your Bath Blue, it's won. And so I said, oh great, so we won the blue cheese category. And he said, no, you've won the entire thing. You're being live streamed on the radio at this very present time. You've just won the World Cheese Awards. Anyway, that was a huge accolade for us. It's one thing to think that you're making a nice cheese and to have regular compliments from your customers, but to be judged to have produced the best cheese in the world against 2,700 other cheeses that have been entered from across the world is an amazing accolade and a real credit to all the cheesemakers that we employ. And it certainly helped to boost the sales of our cheese and helped to raise morale amongst the cheesemakers and on the farm as a whole.
So today, May 2020, we are living in the depths of a national crisis. And although farmers and farming is used to dealing with crises, the way that this COVID virus affects us is insignificant compared to the way it affects people working on the front line. It makes things a little bit difficult because obviously our markets have collapsed and in some cases people have to throw milk away, but these are insignificant. I mean, it's only money. Some people are risking their lives. So I've written a few words about this. Here we go. Now the season moves us on with changes of the air and light. Though sad it is that lockdowns come. Cynically, bright mornings dawn, key workers on the front line fight. And carelessly, spring moves along. Council shows no high day fun. When we ask, will things come right? For some, the summer will not come. Cows lie contented in the sun. Lush grazing year, resplendent sight. And mowing time is coming on. Rainbows made by little children, gifts that help us cope with life. Though some will grieve, the loved ones gone. When at last the danger's gone, we'll think of them, the sacrifice. Applause that cheered a nation on. And thank our stars that COVID's gone. Okay, thank you for watching me and listening to me going on about my passion for farming and cheese making. And I've enjoyed reading my poetry to you. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it. Now I just want to give my book a plug. Here it is. You can buy it online at parkfarm.co.uk.
Daddy, we can't have this. We can't be trying to sell your poetry book.
Why not?
Today's about cheese and the crisis. It's not about your poetry book.
But I've had 1,000 printed.
And how many are left?
About 990.